Private Jack Thomas had never been one to question his instincts. On deployment in the harsh, endless stretches of the Middle Eastern desert, the nights were long and cold, filled with eerie silence that seemed to hum with 1,000 unspoken threats. The air was dry, the wind like a whisper that carried dust and grit, and every shadow felt like it hid something, an ambush, an enemy sniper, or worse. It was around midnight during a routine patrol when Jack's unease started. He'd been walking alongside his squad, keeping an eye on the perimeter. Their unit had set up camp just a few kilometers away, but their job was to ensure nothing moved too close in the dark hours. That was when he heard it. "Hey, Jack!" a voice called out from the shadows ahead. It was Sergeant Davis, his squad leader, motioning for him to follow. "I've spotted something off in the distance. You on watch with me? Let's check it out." Jack nodded and stepped toward Davis. His flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, the beam dancing over the rocky, uneven ground. He fell in behind Davis, keeping pace as they moved away from the camp, heading toward the rocky outcrop in the distance where they'd seen something move moments ago. They walked for a few minutes, the only sounds being their footsteps and the faint breeze. But something wasn't right. Davis was usually chatty during patrols, always keeping the mood light with dry jokes. But tonight, he was quiet. Too quiet. Jack glanced up ahead, his breath catching as he noticed Davis's figure had become more distant. He couldn't make out his face, just the outline of his body moving ahead. "Sergeant Davis?" Jack called out, quickening his pace. "You all right?" No response. Jack's gut twisted. This wasn't like Davis. Something felt off. The air seemed thicker now, heavier, like it was pressing in on him. He picked up the pace, his boots kicking up the loose sand beneath him, and he finally caught up, expecting to see Davis's back just a few meters ahead. But there was nothing. The desert stretched out before him, empty, silent. His pulse quickened. "Sergeant?" Jack whispered, turning in a circle, his flashlight sweeping the darkness. Just as he began to panic, a voice rang out from behind him. "Jack, where the hell are you going?" Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was Corporal Miller, one of the men from his squad. The sound of his voice was like a lifeline, pulling him back to reality. Jack turned around, blinking hard as he tried to make sense of it all. Miller was standing about 10 meters away, staring at him with a look of confusion on his face. "What are you doing out here alone? Why aren't you with Davis?" "Wait, Davis was right here," Jack stammered, spinning back around, shining the light on the empty desert ahead. "I was following him. He called me to check something out. He said there was something suspicious." Miller's face tightened. "Davis? He's been back at camp for over an hour. We haven't seen him since then. You've been out here alone." Jack's stomach dropped. The darkness around him seemed to close in, a shroud of silence engulfing the desert. His mind raced. He had heard Davis's voice, hadn't he? But now, standing in the cold wind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had followed. Nothing. The desert, once expansive and empty, now felt claustrophobic, the silence deafening. Jack turned his flashlight back to where he'd heard the voice, toward the rocky outcrop, but there was no sign of anyone. "Well, what the hell is going on?" Jack muttered, more to himself than to Miller. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. How could he have heard Davis's voice so clearly, felt the footsteps on the ground as if they were right behind him, only for them to vanish without a trace? Miller moved closer, his face tense, his voice low. "We need to get back to camp. Now this isn't right." Jack nodded numbly, still scanning the empty desert. His gut churned with the feeling that something was watching them. The wind carried whispers that seemed to echo Davis's voice, distant but taunting. They started walking back in the direction of the camp, Jack's head spinning with the memory of the voice, the steps, the eerie silence that followed. But as they moved, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see someone just behind him, but every time he turned, the desert was empty. And then, just before they reached the camp, Jack heard it again, a voice soft, breathless, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Jack, you shouldn't have followed." His blood ran cold. He didn't turn around this time.